and a warm welcome to this special panel discussion in the lead up to the World Economic Forum on Africa, set to take place in Durban next week. According to the World Economic Forum Inclusive Growth and Development Report for 2017, South Africa ranks 70th among developing economies on the Inclusive Development Index. South Africa also suffers from extremely high income and wealth inequality. This despite having the 19th highest GDP per capita in this group. Joining me now to unpack just exactly what inclusive growth is and what can be done to bring about impactful change, not only in South Africa, but across our peers in sub-Saharan Africa, is Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, Chief Executive Officer of GE in South Africa, and also President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Joining us via Skype from New York is Ann Bernstein, Executive Director at the Center for Development and Enterprise. Thomas, always good to get your perspective with regard to the activity that we see on the rest of the continent. Do you share the sentiments of your colleagues and peers on the panel? Actually, yes, and I would say that
I think the couple of words ring true here. The discussion from Mr. Gama around the ecosystem is it's not just it's not a one trick. It's not government, it's not private sector. There is an ecosystem you have to build that sustains you through the cycles that we're seeing in places that have mineral economies. I think the other reality is we are way behind the curve. Every year there are about 3 million formal jobs created in Africa. And there are 10 to 12 million youths looking for jobs each year. So that's in a good year. Now, what it means for everybody that can create the ecosystem is how do you do it in a way that isn't just status quo or what we tried 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And I think of an inclusive growth curve as something that starts off with jobs, give a job. That's at the bottom of the curve. Move up to SMEs and creating businesses that will create jobs. That's further up the curve. And then you keep moving up to entrepreneurship. SMEs and entrepreneurship are not the exact same thing. An SME can be a cabbage seller, right? Creating some jobs for farming. But an entrepreneur combines ideas, vision, and an opportunity to create, I think, a long-term business. And then finally you get up into innovation. And how are we innovating? How are we creating completely new zones for us to play in? How are we creating new technologies, ways of using it? So I think that's where the ecosystem demands government for environment, private sector, public sector for stimulus, and then tons of talent and expertise to move us up that curve. That's my view of, if we're going to stop talking and doing, we have to work up that curve.
Exactly. We'll get into that curve and analyze it in just a moment, but we're hearing the multi-pronged approach and various buy-in from a multitude of stakeholders, looking past the waves and looking towards the future when it comes to direction and, of course, the inclusive growth curve. And let's come to you in New York to get your opening remarks and perspective on the current environment in South Africa and across the continent regarding fostering a culture of economic inclusion for many Africans.
Well, I agree with the previous speaker that without growth, we're not going to get any inclusion. And the problem is that people want growth, everyone talks about it, but they don't really want change. So I'm very focused on the priorities we need for reform in order to achieve inclusive growth. And that means we have to have much more labor-intensive economies. We need effective governments that aren't corrupt. And we need to encourage an environment in which investors and businesses want to risk their money. And I think in order to move away from the talk, which everybody wants to do, we have to say, here are my priorities for 2017 or for the next few years. But to just talk in general and assume that all issues are equal doesn't get us very far. So we have a massive challenge in South Africa of unemployment, nearly 9 million people. We're a complete global outlier. And unless we change things, introduce reforms, we're not going to have any impact. So this phrase inclusive growth can mean anything you want it to mean, and people use it in all sorts of different ways. As far as I'm concerned, we need to make the growth process as inclusive as possible, as fast as possible, and we need to make some choices, some tough choices about how to get back to much higher growth rates in South Africa and in many other places on the continent.
Exactly. And that's also dives back to the theme regarding access to markets and the development not only of these people, but the businesses and providing them with markets to tap into. Thomas, I'm not too sure if you wanted to add onto that, as it does take us up on that inclusive growth curve that you alluded to.
It goes to Miriam's point of there may be popular news that says things aren't happening. But if you step back and look over a period of time, I would say it's almost phenomenal to look at where we were maybe 10 years ago to where we are today. I think the program around localization, partnering with transit engineering around the assembly of locomotives, you've moved up the curve. We were at 35%, 34% local content when we first started out about 7 years ago. Today we're at 55% and growing. That 20% is real. It's additional manufacturers in South Africa. And out of the pool that we work with, we actually, 20% of that pool we buy for export. We buy into the GE supply chain outside of South Africa. So that's moving up the curve. You want to move from local production into the quality and capability to compete on the global market. That's South Africa, that's every country if you really want to move up that curve. I think the other part of it is there are some basics that you still have to do. You still have to invest in skills and training. And when you first start, it's difficult. How do I get 100 hours in? Well, if you look now 7, 8 years down the road, we're well past 100,000 hours of skills building, training, travel around the world to learn. So I do think that there's these things tend to now grow on each other. So we're working together on a project to see if we can take some of the technology and growth in South Africa in the rail space. Can we help other countries? We're looking at big economies, Nigeria, other places. Can transit and GE do something? Can we bring other partners together and do something that really is not just doing your own own work at home, but spreading it around and being really a COE for the continent.
Exactly. I'm happy for us to expand on that as well in a moment. But Anne, I do want to come to you to get your perspective as we make our way up this inclusive growth curve, starting with investment in individuals and, of course, bolstering SMMEs to really become entrepreneurial thinkers. And the top element of that curve that Thomas alluded to being innovation. Just a few years ago, we heard of the fourth industrial revolution being a key theme and phrase being thrown around at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And many say that for Africans, there's a slight disconnect because we still focus on the fundamentals of infrastructure to ensure that our economies are efficient when the rest of the world is having a conversation which is far ahead. Do you believe, and what are your thoughts as well with regard to how we ensure that we touch on all the key points of this particular curve and ensuring that as a continent we don't get left behind whilst investing in our people, but making sure that our people are also able to invest in technology for the...
Let me come back to my theme of some choices. If we're going to improve the skills pipeline, which is vitally necessary, there's some things we have to do. We need to improve our domestic institutions for vocational education. We need to ensure that the relationship between companies like GE, world-class company, and what it needs from our vocational education system is much closer than it has been. We've wasted a lot of money, our institutions are producing people at very low rates, very low throughput, very expensive, and then they're not connected to the world of work. We cannot meet the great demand for increased skills and vocational training only through public sector institutions, which means we should follow India, China, Brazil, and a number of other middle-income countries. South Africa and other African countries should invite private actors to come in and help them train their populations. Of course, you need to sort out the rules of the game and your funding rules so that you can get quality output from both public and private institutions. But that's one of the key choices we need to make if we're going to improve the education and skills pipeline. The second issue, which is not all that popular in Africa, is we need to be much more positive about bringing foreign skills and know-how into our countries. This is not a threat to the domestic population. It's in fact an incredibly easy form of, if you like, foreign direct investment. Some other country has trained people, and we're going to get the benefits of that in our country. So a much more positive attitude to skilled immigration into developed countries in Africa, like South Africa and others, is a second absolutely vital choice that needs to be made and could get very quick returns.
From a South African perspective, perhaps we do see that talent exchange taking place at a high level within more larger institutions. But if you're speaking to Jabulani, who's in Alexandra Township, that's a different mindset to kind of implement there. Are there themes that we need to explore to ensure that the message does get down to the average citizen who is hungry, who needs to pay their bills at the end of the day, who needs to take their children to school at the end of the day? I know it's a rather tough dynamic to actually unpack, but at the end of the day, these are the individuals who we might potentially employ within our organizations and become leaders and captains of industry in particular sectors.
Maybe if I can comment on that, because as a multinational, by definition, we're in a lot of different countries, and we train in every country. So I look at my South African employees as a company just as important as my Turkish employees, my Russian, my US employees. And so with that investment in all those different people, it would be crazy for me to say I'm going to keep all my South African employees in South Africa. I'm not going to take them anywhere else. And by the same virtue, if I have a skill set and an expertise that is needed in South Africa, I want to be able to move somebody from Turkey, from the US, from the UK to come and help develop. But I think it's incumbent upon it doesn't just work one way. If you bring foreign talent in, it's very easy simply to rely on that foreign talent, and then eventually they have to go home. And then you're left with what? And that's the part where the connectivity between succession planning, between training, between mentors, mentorship programs, it has to happen. And I think that's something we've seen probably stronger in South Africa than maybe anywhere else. But I think the other part of it is that, one of my favorite countries to travel through is Dubai, or cities is Dubai. Not because of the airline and the airports, but because you look at the pictures on the wall in the Dubai airport and look at 50 years ago when it was a strip, it was sand, you had a fishing village effectively, but somebody had a vision that said bring in external talent that knows what they're doing, create a tax environment, a living environment, a safety environment that lets them practice and see what happens. You go there today and you're talking 1,500 hotels. I don't know if we have 1,500 hotels in Africa in total, but in one city, it's moved in 40 years where I really wish 50 of our cities could do the same. So I think that's one where it does pay off if you structure it right. And
you did have some commentary that you wanted to provide as feedback with regard to the theme. Feel free to unpack it further.
Yes, I want to respond, Gugu, to your points about what does this mean for Mr. Dlamini and Alex. Well, there are a number of issues. The first is that to advocate much more open, skilled migration into South Africa and other developing countries is not to let countries off the hook in improving their own skills pipeline. That's absolutely vital. That's number one. Number two, countries that are more open to immigration grow faster. So you can create more jobs for people in Alex and elsewhere. And I think that how you manage this situation is by effective political and civic leadership. So we don't wait for terrible xenophobic outbursts where criminals and other people who are desperate get involved in horrific incidents. You need to manage this issue that people who come to South Africa with skills, who can teach maths in our schools, who can manage projects, who prepare to risk their money in investing in factories, these people will create jobs for South Africans. And we're not doing that very effectively. And we're losing out on a very important tool to drive much faster growth. So how a country manages its migration policy is absolutely vital. It's complex in many societies, but we're not doing this well. And if you look at Silicon Valley, or you look at Albania, I was at a conference last week in Harvard where there's evidence of the importance of migrant skills in helping to drive a country like Albania, never mind Silicon Valley, where nearly half of the high-tech companies that are driving the world economy, never mind the American economy, have been started by immigrants. And if you have a policy that keeps those people out of your country, developing countries will never get the know-how that's available to them from the rest of the world.
You're prepared for the World Economic Forum, which is set to take place in Durban next week. And joining us for our conversation on inclusive growth as well as time to make impact that is tangible is Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, Chief Executive Officer of GE in South Africa and President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Via Skype, we have from New York, Ann Bernstein, Executive Director at the Center for Development and Enterprise. You mentioned something so important, and that's getting rid of the borders, and that takes us to the overriding objective of the World Economic Forum on Africa, is that it's not just a South African view, a Rwandan view, a Tanzanian view, but it's understanding how all these major economies can move forward going together. From your experience and some of the projects that you've implemented as Transnet, are we seeing a positive change taking place with regard to the dynamics regarding regional integration and regional dynamics to move these entities and the continent forward using technology as well as the skills and services that are available from a cross-border perspective? I'm happy to get your view, and then we'll go to Ann shortly.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think also as co-chair of the World Economic Forum in Africa next week, part of what we want to achieve is how could we make sure that there is better intra-African trade. We only really trade amongst ourselves as Africans about 17% of the available trade. So there's still a lot of things that we need to do. There's still a lot of connections, either through infrastructure or through regional integration, whether it's within the maritime sector or the railway or the road. So there's a lot of conversation and discussion in terms of saying, as Africans, how can we improve and how can we trade with each other more? How can we look at some of the customs processes, for instance, and have paperless documentation? How do we deal with clogging at some of our borders? So there's a great conversation in terms of how to move Africa forward, because that is an important aspect. So we don't want to meet at the World Economic Forum only to network, but it's really to say, how do we shape a new agenda? How do we shape a new conversation that takes us forward, and that we can go back to subsequent fora and say, this is what we discussed in 2017, this is what has been achieved as a result of that engagement between ourselves.
And to get your perspective on this particular theme, you've got a commentary to add?
Look, I'm obviously in favor of innovation, and I'm in favor of much greater trade between African countries and getting rid of the barriers to that. But if we're going to come back to inclusive growth, we have to talk about low-skilled jobs, because through no fault of their own, many millions of people in South Africa and in the continent do not have experience and do not have a decent education. And so the big challenge, if you want to talk about inclusion, is how do we create jobs for people who have never had jobs before? And that, luckily, doesn't require innovation. And developing countries can build on the experience elsewhere to get involved in activities that don't require new ways of doing things or all sorts of innovative things that I'm in favor of. But if you're looking at how we're going to provide inclusion for these millions of people who are excluded, and not just more and more for the insiders who have jobs, we have to focus on the something like 80 to 90 million jobs that are moving out of China in low-skill factories and how we can create the environment in which some of those factories will come to South Africa and other African countries. Ethiopia is ahead of the game. They've created an export footwear industry with Chinese investors. South Africa, we need to get into this market, and we have both domestic investors and we can attract international investors, but we're not doing that. So it's not that I'm ignoring the progress that has been made, but if we're serious about inclusion, we need to talk much more about all the people who are not part of the modern economy.
And I'd like to get your views as we build up on this theme. As you say, job creation is quite critical and ensuring that it's jobs that are easy for people to gain access to. But how do we address giving people jobs with also ensuring that they not only have jobs for the current environment, which make them relevant to the local economy that they work in, but also globally competitive, which again ties back to the initial theme that we did hear from Miriam regarding technological services and companies to help aid and support skills development. So are there tangible suggestions that you can provide regarding how to grasp both these particular concepts and bring them together for sustainable job creation, not just for the short term and locally effective, but also globally relevant and globally competitive jobs for the future?
Not all factories are being automated. Some are, but certainly a lot of low-skilled textile and other factories are not being automated. And the world's best experts are saying this isn't going to happen for 10, 15 years. So there's lots we can do that's appropriate to the level of skill of our population. Secondly, South Africa, for example, has to work incredibly hard now to get an investment grade that's absolutely vital to get growth going again. And I don't think it helps to try and ignore the reality that this country is in deep, deep trouble, and that has consequences for the rest of the subcontinent. So we've gone backwards in South Africa in many respects, and we're not going to move off a stagnant growth rate unless the country takes some tough decisions to get us back to investment grade and start getting a much higher growth rate that is akin to what the National Development Plan has argued for. It's no good talking about the National Development Plan and we're nowhere near that growth rate. Of course, the higher parts of our economy, the more sophisticated parts, need all of this, but they also need the kinds of skills to innovate. And that's where my point about fix the domestic education and skills pipeline, which requires some tough choices about performance management. And at the same time, bring in the skills that we don't have. And Mr. Garland and I disagree about the facts, because although some big companies are able to bring in some skills, the economy needs lots and lots and lots of skills. And the truth is, over the last 10, 15 years, we've kind of been losing skills.
We do have about 5 minutes left to start drawing up on our closing remarks, but I do know, Anne, you had some feedback that you wanted to provide with regard to the discussion, but allude to that as well as concluding and giving us your concluding views as to what needs to be put at the table at WEF Africa come Durban with regard to seeing and making a tangible impact regarding inclusion in the continent.
I think the key issue, if we're serious about the phrase inclusive growth, is to answer this question. What are we providing the population we have now in terms of work? In other words, South Africa and other African countries have to create jobs for the workforce they actually have, not the highly skilled one they wish they had. I wish we had that too, but we don't. We have millions and millions of people who have never worked before and through no fault of their own have come out of a terrible education system. that's partly why we have to be looking at creating much more labor-intensive economies, not to the exclusion of the high-tech parts of the economy, but if we are to be inclusive within a country, you have to have more labor intensity. And we can go on and on about all sorts of other things, but the fact is, unless South Africa changes, we're going to continue to have one of the largest unemployment sort of proportions of our population in the world. So that's the reality and the facts that we're dealing with. And it's how we do that. What are the key issues that we need to wrestle with and take choices about that are different from what we've been doing up till now? It's not that everything we've been doing has been terrible, but we have to do things differently if the subcontinent's most important economy is going to start growing again. And I don't think we can keep reverting back to what we've been doing in the past. So I'm advocating taking inclusion seriously. That means more labor-intensive kinds of production. And that is going to involve some tough choices about reform. And we're not going to get growth unless we start doing things differently.
Quite a multi-pronged approach that is clearly being reflected by our panelists today regarding how we can really achieve impactful inclusion on the African continent from an economic perspective. Well, that does bring us to the end of this discussion and a special interview for today. A big thank you to my panelists, Siyabonga Gama, CEO of Transnet, Dr. Miriam Altman, strategist at Altman Advisory, Thomas Konditi, CEO of GE in South Africa, and also President and CEO of GE Transportation Africa. Not forgetting Ann Bernstein, Executive Director for the Center for Development and Enterprise, joining us via Skype from New York. From myself, Kukule Tucele, and the team, that's where we leave it for now, but keep the conversation going regarding the World Economic Forum Africa on 410.